And welcome back. Tom Hartman here with you, and Lamar Waldron in the studio with me, and we are talking about his new book, Watergate, The Hidden History, Nixon, the Mafia, and the CIA. I want to come back to the McCord thing when we come back from the break, from the next break, if that's okay with you, because our commercial radio listeners I'm sure would like to hear the rest of that. So during this break, I'm just curious, it's a kind of a slug line, I guess, on the bottom of the book says, a groundbreaking investigation of what Nixon was really after and why he risked the presidency to get it. It was, you want to just re-summarize that for people who are just joining us?
Sure. He wanted to get what we call the Cuban dossier, what the CIA likes to call the Black Book, which was a big volume prepared by Fidel Castro of CIA attempts to kill Fidel Castro.
So Nixon was trying to get, the Watergate burglary was all about Nixon trying to get a document that Fidel Castro put together? And gave to the Democrats?
Well, no, he gave it, it's never clear that he did give it to the Democrats. Nixon was so paranoid, he worried if it fell into Democratic hands, that would be bad.
Uh-huh.
And the head of the Democratic Party, Larry O'Brien, whom the NBA's championship trophy is named after today because he later became NBA commissioner, had worked for Howard Hughes. And Howard Hughes's man, private investigator Robert Mayhew, had worked on those CIA mafia plots that Nixon had spawned in 1960 to kill Fidel with the mafia.
What was Mayhew's role in those?
Mayhew was the go-between. Mayhew had done jobs for Nixon before. Mayhew was the cutout. He was a private detective for Hughes. He had done a couple jobs for Nixon before. So in 1960, the CIA officially went through Mayhew to deal with Johnny Roselli and Santo Trafficante and those guys. So the CIA wound up dealing with them directly, too.
Mm-hmm.
So they worried that Robert Mayhew, who by 72 had fallen out with Howard Hughes, Larry O'Brien had briefly worked for Howard Hughes, that Mayhew had told O'Brien something about those plots, number one, but that if the Democrats, McGovern, O'Brien, anybody got that Cuban dossier, and Cuba and Chile were very close at the time because Chile had that socialist president, Salvador Allende. And so they worried that if somebody had that dossier, they needed to know what it said. Did it spell out everything in all the detail? Nixon's longtime dealing with the mafia, the Hoffa bribes. What did it say? They didn't know. They only had a tiny piece of a 90-plus page document. And that's what they had to go into the Chilean embassy for. That's what they had to go into the Watergate attempt 4 times to do that.
Right. And so Nixon was looking for the documentation that would not only show something that he could arguably say was a good thing, that he was trying to kill Castro.
Depending on how it was written down.
Right. But also that he was involved with the mafia and with these bribes, and that he had taken $1 million in bribes.
Twice. Including once, just 5 months or so before the first Watergate break-in. So this was an ancient history. That last Mafia Hoffa Nixon bribe, December 71. Wow. So that's what it was about. And people should know, in the book, we print the Cuban dossier that Nixon was so desperate to get in its entirety. Is in the book.
Really?
You can have in that book what Nixon gave up his presidency to get. And the final analysis, when it was finally made public, more than a year after Nixon resigned, in some ways it was not as bad as Nixon had feared. In some ways it was as bad as Nixon had feared.
Right. Remarkable. Well, if it could have sent him to prison, it was pretty bad. Lamar Waldron is with us. The book, Watergate, The Hidden History. We'll be right back with more of the Watergate break-in. Today, the anniversary of the death of Bobby Kennedy, who was not directly involved with this, but had his own involvement with some of the same people for more noble goals, actually.
That's right. And in fact, McCord is one of 4 people who were working on operations for Bobby Kennedy and John F. Kennedy in 1963, and for Bobby early in 64, who played key roles in exposing Nixon and others. It wasn't just Woodward and Bernstein, because you'll look in Woodward and Bernstein, you won't see anything about the mafia. You'll see very little about the CIA. You know, they did a great job. All the President's Men's a great read, but that was a small part of the story. People don't realize that book, they had finished that book in January of 1974, 8 months before Nixon resigned. The book was out in bookstores months before Nixon resigned. So, you know, it doesn't tell the whole story. But James McCord, who was working, allegedly, I should say, because he's still alive, on part of one of Bobby Kennedy's most secret plans to bring democracy to Cuba in '63. McCord was a retired high CIA official.
So he is not a mafia guy.
He's not a mafia guy. When one of Bobby's aides talked to us about McCord, he was different from Barker and Hunt. I mean, he was, he's a conservative Christian, but he seems to really believe stuff and not just do it for show. So, he wrote a letter to Judge John Sirica. All the Watergate burglars had pretty much pleaded guilty. McCord had been convicted.
Sirica, once again, was the guy the judge who was overlooking the
Watergate prosecution
for the Watergate burglars.
And basically, the Watergate burglars, most of them, pleaded, except for Lydia McCord, pleaded guilty, said no higher-ups were involved. It was just us on our own. Yeah, it was a nice day.
They took a fall for the employer.
And McCord wrote this letter after Nixon had finally fired his CIA director, Richard Helms, who figures into the book very largely. McCord wrote this letter to Sirica saying, hey, it goes way higher. People are lying about this. Then the story finally was on the front pages again after months and months.
This is long after Woodward and Bernstein's book. Woodward and Bernstein's book is out.
No, actually. This is March of '73. Woodward and Bernstein are still writing their book. But the story is dead and has been dead for months, and Richard Nixon's gotten reelected in a landslide. So the story would have died if not for McCord's letter. The next guy that comes up, and the thing is, though, is Woodward and Bernstein would have never possibly reported the story if not for a guy by the name of Joseph Califano. Joseph Califano.
Later headed up HEW.
Right, under Jimmy Carter. Joseph Califano in 1963 was the assistant to Cyrus Vance, Secretary of the Army, and Joseph Califano and Cyrus Vance played big roles in JFK and Bobby's secret Cuba plans.
Right.
Joseph Califano was the counsel for the Democratic National Committee at the Watergate and for the Washington Post. The morning of the arrest, he gets called, of course, because he represents the Democratic National Committee, the DNC, and then it's Joseph Califano that calls the Washington Post and says, "Hey, you guys should cover this story," and boy, this could go all the way to the White House. And then, on the morning of the 18-minute gap, which the book does explain for the first time, Joseph Califano files a lawsuit for the DNC against the Republicans, which also helped to keep the case alive and get more evidence.
Wow.
Let's flash ahead to the spring of 1973. John Ehrlichman and H.R. Haldeman, Nixon's top two aides, have had to resign because of the fallout from McCord's letter. The new chief of staff for Richard Nixon is Alexander Haig. Now, Haig had been working in the White House as an assistant national security advisor under Henry Kissinger after getting the job thanks to a recommendation from Joseph Califano. Haig calls Joseph Califano, says, hey, Nixon wants me to be his chief of staff. Should I do it? And Califano says, yeah, you should. And so Alexander Haig had worked with Joseph Califano and JFK and Bobby in '63 on that
Cuba contingency plan, yeah.
Right. Then we flash ahead to the tapes. The revelation of the tapes by Alexander Butterfield. That didn't just put the Watergate hearings on the front page. That made it must-see TV.
Right. Because it's now a media event.
Right.
There's audio.
Alexander Butterfield. Guess who he worked with in late 1963, early '64? He worked with Alexander Haig and Joseph Califano on the wind down of the secret coup plan that JFK and Bobby had for '63. So you had these three guys that worked together in '63, Haig, Califano, and Butterfield. And of course, Haig is the guy who later talked Nixon into resigning.
Right.
He is the one. Nixon wanted to fight it in a trial because he knew the national security excuse could technically get him off.
Right.
But Haig maneuvered him out. So those three guys who worked together in '63 under the Kennedys played key roles, and they were working on a different side of the operation in '63 than James McCord.
Amazing. In 20 seconds, can you explain the gap in the tape?
The gap in the tape is when the New York Times identified E. Howard Hunt as having played a key role in the Bay of Pigs, and the lawsuit was filed, so Nixon worried everything was going to come out about his CIA mafia plots. By the time of the smoking gun tape, he wasn't having to say CIA mafia plots. He was referring to it as the Bay of Pigs thing. But apparently, on the day of the 18-minute gap, even though Nixon left tons of other crimes unerased, he knew the CIA mafia plots, those Nixon mafia Hoffa bribes, that was too much. That had to be erased.
So he erased it. So he got Rosemary Woods to do it, or whatever.
No, he did it. Rosemary Woods was.
Richard Nixon did it himself?
All the evidence points to Richard Nixon doing it himself. There's not one erasure. There's several. There are more erasures that same day and missing recordings from that same day. So it's not even just one 18-minute gap from one day.
Amazing. Lamar Waldron. The book is Watergate, The Hidden History, Nixon, the Mafia, and the CIA. It's in bookstores now this week. Lamar, thanks for being with us.